Hello everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. As always, I am one of your hosts, Zach.
And I am your other erstwhile host, Aaron.
And we just want to say a quick thank you to all of the new and returning listeners. We love you, we appreciate you, and we also ask all of you to please like, subscribe, or do whatever the thing is that's positive on the platform that you choose to listen to us on. And also, if you wouldn't mind, please give us a share with your wonderful friends, or perhaps, as we love to say, a mortal enemy. Unless that mortal enemy is Sauron, he owes me a lot of money. Fuck you.
Yes. Fuck that guy.
And there goes our monetization.
Which we rely on to keep the lights on over here at SPR Studios.
This week on SPR, we have my friend John Henderson on the call. Not right now, but he will be there. As you can tell, this episode took us a little bit later than expected, at least based on the tweets that I tweeted out a few weeks ago. But John and Aaron and myself, we had a conversation a few weeks ago around a few different things, and unfortunately, due to some technical issues, we had to kind of mess with the way that this conversation ended up occurring. So you'll hear us kind of narrate some portions of this discussion. But for some quick bona fides on the John part, John has actually shipped several games, 7 to be precise, between 2008 to 2015 with NCSoft as a customer service agent. That started with City of Heroes, which some of you might know, and ended with WildStar, which is a personal favorite game of mine. In addition to that, he is a large community advocate in the Austin game development scene, hosting a local meetup that's pretty big called the Game Dev Beer Night.
Yeah, it was really nice of John to take some time out of his busy schedule and discuss what turned out to be a pretty wide range of topics involving the games industry. This first one focuses pretty heavily on career satisfaction and some general advice in terms of, finding your balance, both while you're hunting for that job or, deciding whether, the full-time grind is really what works best for you. So without further ado, I suppose we can hop on into that.
You've had a lot of different roles: recruiter, game master, account administrator, content writer, all these other things that I probably would have mentioned in the introduction. Which of those have been, kind of like the most rewarding to you during your professional career?
Well, I did anticipate that question, obviously. And you should just understand, and everyone listening to this, you're not talking to someone, one, who regards his professional development all that seriously. I just never have. And I'm constantly at war with myself about whether that's a good idea. But also, I have had a number of jobs, and I consider myself blessed to have lots of different opportunities, but none of them have really been what I've been looking forward to do. And I'm generally well known for the things that don't make me money. And some of those things have led to things that do make me money at different times. But I think it's worth reiterating to people, because it's easy to forget, is that we need to be independent and we need to be happy, all of us who are living in a capitalist society such as we do. But that doesn't mean that the thing that makes us money is the thing that makes us happy and gives us all the fulfillment. What I tell young people a lot, and it makes me sound like a horrible old man, but if you can balance those things, then you're doing better than half the planet. So don't think that the thing that makes you money is the thing that makes you happy as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, again, as we'd kind of discussed a little bit, I think a lot of us do kind of get lost in the sauce. And I think especially, I know for myself, now back longer ago than I'd like to admit is true, going into college and then coming out of college, there was absolutely this perception that if I did not find a job specifically doing what I loved, and that was what was making me money and bringing me that fulfillment, I had in some way failed. And in a lot of ways, I still kind of struggle with that mentality. But I think it is kind of worth making the distinction that one's career does not always have to be the thing that they find the most fulfillment in.
Yeah,
I mean, it's great if you can get both at the same time, but
I would argue that you don't even really have to call it a career. You just need to have a means to pay your bills and then have enough time and energy to do all the other things that you want to do. And also explore, because not everyone knows what they like or know themselves quite so well. And that's another thing, is the pursuit of self and understanding of self. These are all normal human things that we all ought to be concerned about, but just going to a job and doing the requirements, or going to school and doing the degree requirements, and then at the end you get handed a piece of fancy paper and said, go off into the world, it's all up to you now.
Well, so I have a quick question, John, and we'll get to this, but obviously, you work with a lot of people trying to break into the games industry. You're a big community, at least in my mind, a community leader, advocate, organizer in Austin, Texas. I think you've helped me through quite a few questions that I've had. So I feel like my thing with a lot of people, this isn't even just in games, it's just people even my age trying to figure out what do they want to do as a job, what do they want to do in life even. I feel like a lot of people don't do a good job of understanding the things that they like that make up a job. And I think that's what really can make things difficult for finding like a healthy balance or a trajectory in life. I'm just curious if you agree. So like as an example for me, I really like support roles. I like that feeling of supporting and helping people. I like working on a project. I like when I have different projects, so I'm not constantly working on the same thing. These are things that are present in multiple multiple jobs. It's not like I sat down and I was like, I have to work at Unity on the multiplay team as a technical account manager, and that is the only thing that I'm ever going to look to do is to be a technical account manager. I've got like these sub things that I enjoy. Just curious, because in my brain, I'm seeing kind of a connection to what you're talking about to some degree. Do you see that a lot with some of the people that you talk to that are trying to get into the games industry? What are your general thoughts on that?
So the question I ask, or one of several that I ask young people and just get this deer in headlights look, is who do you know who does what you think you want to do for a living? And so often the answer is not just no one, but they haven't even considered that that's an important thing to know. Because you can study lots of different subjects. You can either go to school for it, or you can study by yourself and try and figure things out, both for the working world, for the sake of, what jobs are available and what can I do to make enough money to live on. And then also in the context you're talking about, what would I not hate? And I very much advocate finding work that makes money that you don't hate, but it's work. And the nature of work is work sucks. Because if it was perfectly enjoyable, no one would pay you for it. You just treat it like vacation. But the truth is you're doing a job because someone else regards your efforts as valuable. So damn it, you better well pay me for that. Otherwise, I'm not doing it for you. If I do it at all, I'm just going to do it for myself. And why not in that regard? But if someone else is giving you directions and promising you money and giving you tasks, then that's a job and that's a different arrangement. But I think a lot of people coming into the work world don't understand that that's the nature of work. That's always been the nature of work. Certainly from the days of Henry Ford and the assembly line, making automobiles. Not every job is unionized. Not every job has a great work-life balance built into what they call the culture. Not every job is the same, and it ultimately is going to depend on what the nature of the work is and whether you find it at all interesting, whether it's within your existing skill set, whether you get to learn new things, whether the people that you answer to and work with are enjoyable. These are things that don't get brought up, or at least they didn't when I was in college, very much in classes. But they do bring up when you have simulations of applied knowledge. Like if you wanted to work in newspapers, like I did, you would work on the student newspaper, and you would have a faculty advisor, but you're basically left up to your own devices. You have a structure within the work, but it's all being done by the students. Or if you wanted to make video games, then you better figure out a way to make a game with a team. You go to the game jam, you go to whatever is required for you to apply the knowledge you have and have something to show for it. Not just for the sake of getting a job, but proving to yourself that this is something that you want to do and would want to do more than once. These are all things that can be learned and ought to be learned one way or the other. But again, if people don't take the initiative and don't get told, hey, this is important, you ought to do it, then they don't.
Yeah, so I think from that initial bit of audio, also welcome back. Here we are again narrating. I think it's really important when we discuss the section about understanding what you enjoy out of a job as opposed to tying yourself down to a specific title, mostly because I see a lot of people think that they're very limited in scope in terms of what they can actually do. But when you break things down into what you're good at and what you enjoy, I think what people tend to find, Aaron, is that there's a lot more that you can do in life. And that's especially important in an industry that's so competitive like the games industry, because you really have to play to your strength while also, hopefully having a good time, because you can really easily burn out when trying to get into games.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I will say on that is, of course, the best art comes from passion and people creating it passionately. So if you know what is fulfilling to you when you're trying to find any role, even if the title isn't the one that you would have seen yourself in, if the components that make up the actual job give you that satisfaction, then that is, of course, what's most important in that case. And kind of relating to burnout, but mostly continuing the trend of a little bit of career advice, our next bit of the conversation with John kind of focused on starting small projects and gathering resources and finding ways to stay motivated while if not breaking into the industry, then working on projects of your own, which are, of course, vitally important to being part of the games industry, right? Because if you're not making something, then, you're still a passive observer. So, yeah, we took a little bit of time and dug into some of that with him. And here are some of his thoughts.
Well, I'm a big fan of a guy named Edmund McMillan. Do you know who this guy is?
I do know the name.
I'm not familiar.
Oh, you're familiar with his games, Super Meat Boy, The Binding of Isaac, the upcoming Eugenics. He grew
he
up.
Loves pushing the envelope.
I mean, he has given so many great talks that are on YouTube. A lot of people saw him for the first time in Indie Game the movie, because he was the guy who didn't seem to be completely stuck in his own head. Like, you could actually see, even though he describes himself as agoraphobic and doesn't like to get out very much, which, again, pretty typical attitude for a game developer. But he says things like, if you really want to be a game developer, make lots of little games. Because that's what he did. I mean, he started out as just an illustrator, and that's all he thought he was doing. He was making weird illustrations in Flash and putting them up on Newgrounds, which is something that still exists, and people seem to regard it as this relic of the internet. But in fact,
I've always wondered about that.
But if Edmund McMillan will say that if you make lots of games that are small, you're not spending a whole lot of time on going down rabbit holes part way, and you don't have to suspend so much of gratification, because you're going to spend a whole lot of time with unfinished, broken stuff that isn't fun at all. And that can be discouraging and even depressing, depending on the people involved. But you have to go through that. That's the work. That's the hard part. That's the part that sucks. And it will be fun when it's done, and you have to keep reminding yourself of that because it's very easy to forget. Uh, but again, it's just about finding good advice from the people that know things. And I don't think enough people even know how to research it. Like I tell people all the time, gamedeveloper.com, read that. Every day,
Yeah,
read that.
It's a good site.
Find any story about what they called postmortems, stories about what it took to actually get a game done and put it out there. That's the next best thing to actually knowing someone personally who can tell you real things, because what they'll tell you about is not what you learn in class about game development. You learn about all the other things, interpersonal relationships, business relationships, what the market does, and trying to find testing and reacting to it and changing things that seemed to be true when you got started, but in the process of pursuing the game itself, you learned weren't true, and you had to change things that you didn't think you'd have to. All these things are important, and you're not expected to understand them until you do them. So do it like Ed McMillan does. Just make lots of small games, and then you can work your way up into doing it professionally. And that's your answer to the question of when do I get to do this professionally? A lot of people who are making games, especially in the indie space, they didn't quit their day jobs. And people don't understand that. A lot of them have their main jobs at a school. A lot of indie game developers, Bennett Foddy made QWOP and Getting Over It. He has a job as a professor. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. Just understand that this is a way you have to balance your life. You're probably not going to make all your money doing the thing you love doing, but you can do it for good reasons, which could be your own personal fulfillment.
Yeah. Well, I think the big thing you hit on there, John, that myself as someone that still does art struggles with is you just you need to finish projects. If you just keep restarting and quitting and not actually finishing anything, then like you said, it can be very hard to keep up motivation and just be very discouraging. So yeah, if you take things and you make the scope smaller, then you'll finish more projects, you'll get that dopamine, you'll get that fulfillment, you'll learn more, you'll feel motivated, all that stuff that you just mentioned. So I think that's great.
This perspective also is important for things like if you get involved with a game jam. I have facilitated many game jams, either through Global Game Jam that happens every year in January. I've seen the look in people's faces on Friday night and compared to what it looks like on Sunday morning. They've gone through it. They've gone through 2 days of trying to get something to work, and their attitude has changed. But sometimes I've also seen teams spend all day Saturday thinking that they're going to make Skyrim in 2 days. And they're arguing about character stats and stuff that has nothing to do with what, dude, you're not going to get that done. Just make something small within your means and you'll learn so much more for it. That's the point of this. So another thing that I think I should emphasize is do things purposefully. It doesn't have to work out a certain way, but understand why you're trying to do it when you begin. And that purpose may change over time and project to project or just trying to learn things on your own, but be purposeful about it. Understand that you're going to do this because you want to learn a certain thing or because you want to explore something within a game context that you think might work. If you find out in the process that it doesn't work, then hey, you will have learned something and that will have fulfilled a purpose.
Hello, it's us. We're here again. So I wanted to just take a second, Zach, kind of commiserate with you and get your opinion on something, because one of my favorite portions of that discussion was talking about little games, taking on bite-sized projects and seeing them through from start to finish. Because in my experience with game jams, both in and out of the classroom, I definitely ended up feeling a lot more satisfaction from something like a 48-hour game jam that I would participate in. Granted, the sleep was non-existent and the schedule was grueling, but spending that time in concentrated creative mode and analytical mode, trying to iterate, ideate, create, and then get it out the door and get it all working so quickly, ended up feeling actually really good to me. You know, we started with a small idea and executed on a small product. It never had to be so ambitious that we couldn't achieve most of what we were trying to get done. And those experiences I actually took a lot more from than some of the month-long game jams that we did as part of the Game Developers Association at Ohio University, or even the semester-long game jams that we did as part of the actual, or I did as part of the actual course load. Because in those I found, you know, the scope of the project would kind of balloon and then shrink suddenly, and, you know, certain features would get put on the back burner, stuff that was hard would get kind of worked around until it was too late and it got to get cobbled together. And the overall flow of those projects was not what I would call conducive to continued motivation in a lot of ways. So I found it interesting that John had kind of also picked up on the idea that small projects are a really good way not only to build out one's portfolio, but also to stay motivated while you're, you know, learning and building on ideas and, you know, honing your craft.
I think the important thing, one, I agree with you, but I think the important thing is when he was just talking about remaining motivated, right? It's all about keeping the ball rolling. You don't want to, you know, get your tires stuck and just be spinning your wheels, so to speak, because when that happens, everything gets incredibly stressful. You can lose motivation. You just don't enjoy yourself. And like he was saying, you really, a lot of the process, a lot of the joy comes from completing something, not necessarily like going through the process itself. Although you can certainly find joy in that. A lot of the time, you're probably going to be like problem solving. You might be a little bit stressed out, especially if you're doing a 48-hour game jam and you're not getting a ton of sleep.
Yeah.
So a lot of the joy does come from finishing these small ideas. I think another thing that he hit on and you just hit on was scope creep. Right? That is a big thing that negatively impacts people early on. I think people get overly ambitious and they try to complete these really complex projects. If you just do simple projects, gradually you'll be able to do things that are more complicated in a shorter period of time. But generally speaking, in the example that John mentioned, you're not going to make Skyrim. You're certainly not going to make Skyrim in a weekend. You're definitely not going to make it if you're new to game development. I'm sorry. I don't mean to like crap on your skill level, but just realistically, you do not have the game dev chops. I don't. So, you know, I'm not saying I could do it either. But I think that's a big thing. And even AAA studios have issues with scope creep. We see content cut all the time so that like a vision can get more refined. So I would say, like John was talking about, keep the game small, keep it concise, focus on one specific game loop that's fun and enjoyable, and start there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good advice, not just for people starting out in the process of learning game development, but also just for like prototyping ideas, right? I remember again, to go back to, and I mentioned this at some point, when we interviewed Austin Drozen, our friend who is an educator over at Game U, I remember talking to him about sort of his process because he was usually involved in working on some sort of small scope project. And a lot of it was based on the idea of prototyping simple, almost like maybe singular mechanics that he found interesting, right? And so he would highlight a mechanic and then kind of build a small game concept around that mechanic. And not only by the end of that project was he much more adept at implementing that mechanic feasibly or theoretically into a larger project down the road, but he had a pretty well polished small project that hadn't taken, you know, years off of his life in the process. So yeah, I think that sort of thing is highly valuable.
Yeah, no, I think that's honestly a really solid way to handle it, is just focus around one single mechanic that you have a lot of fun with. I know EA, there's a saying that's find the fun. And as much as people meme on EA for a variety of reasons, I do think that that's relevant because ultimately we play games to have fun. And the quicker that you can find a game mechanic that's fun and you can build around that, the quicker that you can make a small contained experience that's finishable, but also something that people can enjoy. So I think that's really the key takeaway. I'm glad that he brought up this Ed McMillan example. I think that's honestly probably one of the most important things for people going into the games industry is to understand the importance of finishing a project, especially when I myself struggle with that quite frequently. So it resonates a lot with me. What I would say then is our conversation, it moved past advice for the most part, because one of the biggest questions I had for John going into this conversation is I knew I wanted to talk to him about the state of the games industry. We talked about it a few times on the podcast, but obviously it looks a little bit grim with all of the layoffs, with AI coming. It's just a very weird time for people, one, in the industry, but also people trying to break in and get jobs. So I wanted to make sure that we could ask him a little bit about his opinion on the state of the industry and if it's really as bad as it feels to some of us that are a little bit younger.
Well, I believe that there is a boom and bust cycle, and that I can actually cite observations here in Austin. About every 4 to 5 years, there is a bust. You know, what happens about every 4 or 5 years? There's a new console, there's a new technology. The truth is that video games have only been around for about 50 years. But careerism in games only started when the first hints that video games became a mainstream medium, and that didn't happen until the mid-90s. That didn't happen until the first PlayStation and the first Quake game. And that was the point when games started selling to the point where having a job was sustainable. If you talk to anyone who had a job making video games before 1993, they'll tell you that they didn't think of it like a career. They just thought of it as something that they were doing right now, and they anticipated, even if they were being told, hey, you'll have a job forever, this is Origin Systems, we don't fire anyone. Yeah, you don't fire anyone until you get bought out by EA, and then they shut the whole thing down because you're losing way too much money on development. But understand that that's a perspective that they had way back when, whereas now you can go into a massive student debt for a degree in video game development. This is something that's happened about every 5 or 10 years. What I genuinely believe this happened about 5 years ago is that there was a downturn between 2017 and 2018. But think about what was happening then. We had the Nintendo Switch, we had Fortnite, we had PUBG. And this is just an own personal theory, but I think that might have been enough of a raise in the overall market to kind of smooth things out for everyone else. Because there were a bunch of layoffs about then, but we hardly ever talk about it. Whereas what happened starting in November of 22, we had the end of this giant arms race for talent that the big tech companies, Amazon, Facebook, basically everyone except Apple, were just inflating salaries and just trying to recruit the same people just to say they had them. And a lot of them were working on just bogus projects that didn't make any money. And ultimately, some of them lost billions. But they had CEO support. Like, did you realize that Alexa, Amazon's little doohickeys that you can tell it to play music or whatever, it had a games division at one point. People were making games for that. And I'm like, okay, but it ultimately came out that Amazon had lost about like $3 billion of those things because they were selling them at cost. And people were like, well, maybe you can buy stuff with them. It's like, it's Amazon. I think they do fine with the web interface and their phone apps as far as selling stuff. If there was a way to do it through Alexa, people turn that off because they don't want like their dog to accidentally buy a car or something. In any case,
now wait a minute.
These are all things that are. I mean, maybe I don't even know if that's possible. Never mind about Amazon, but in any case, that started happening. People were being laid off by the hundreds of thousands, and there are people that had come here to America to work on a work visa and are being told, "Hey, you got to find another job if someone will sponsor you within 60 days, or you go back where you came from." Which is really tragic and not what I would hope is what people want the American tech industry to be thought of. But that's how things got started, and eventually it kind of percolated down to games. But what had been happening through the pandemic, which again, that's absolutely something unprecedented. Hopefully you understand that. That only happens about once every 100 years to the planet as a whole, where there's some big disease that people have to hide indoors to escape. But what happened at the start of that is people couldn't do anything but stay inside and watch lots of streaming media and play lots of video games. And oh, look what that does to the market. It spiked. And there were some people who rather irresponsibly looked at that and goes, that's the new trend. No, it wasn't. It was a spike created by a pandemic. Granted, at that time, in early 2021, we didn't know how long that was going to last. The other thing that was happening during the pandemic is there was mass consolidation. We had the big companies buying the smaller companies, and no one was really complaining about that, at least at the start. But what people did not know what was the real thing behind it. Like sometimes those small companies were on their last legs. Like they did not have the means to continue existing the way they had been unless someone bought them out. And everyone's like, oh, we have deeper pockets now. This is going to be great. Well, the truth is now is your parent company, their margins are now your margins. And if you aren't going to be making money to the level that your parent company is used to, then they can write you entirely off with a stroke of a pen and not lose any sleep about it. And guess what they did? Some of them totally were not going to be making enough money, but then the parent company would take all the heat for it, which is both sometimes entirely deserved and other times probably not so much. I do think that it's disproportionately benefits the people that have ownerships in the companies rather than the working people that actually provide value to the companies. What's happening right now is people need to understand this is a problem with cash flow. If they don't have cash on hand, and most game projects often are, what are you spending money on? I mean, you might be spending on facilities if you have an office. You might be spending on computers and software licenses, but most of what you're spending on, like 80-90%, it's on salaries. And if you're running into a cash crunch, you might have started a project thinking, well, we'll get to a certain point and we'll have a milestone that we can then sell to someone else, and then they'll give us more money to continue working on this. But that's a gamble that you're making. And oftentimes the people in charge, they're really great creatives and they have a great idea that they think they can sell, but they're not good at the business. And they may make a deal that enables them to make the game, but after the game comes out, then it depends on whether the game can find a market and will sell to a certain level, which again, if they were able to stay independent, would have been a certain level, but a parent company might expect a whole lot more. And the expectations are determined whether certain people have jobs or whether they run out of money and they have to either lay people off or cut their salary, in which case they'll just quit. All these things are factors, and whether or not people have jobs or not.
Yeah.
And absolutely what's happening right now is the Fed, the Federal Reserve in America, raised interest rates mainly to stave off what they said was a post-pandemic depression, the kind of which America has never had to deal with and thankfully didn't. But right now, it's an echo of the post-dot-com boom back in 1999 and 2000. Again, I was around for that. I remember that. And they raised interest rates from basically nothing to 5.25%. I think that's what it is right now. Well, a lot of the companies had investors that weren't really investors because they didn't really have money. They were just spending their debt. And that was fine when you're only having to pay back the banks or the people that lent you the money. But if you're having to pay an extra 5%, well, if you're in hock for millions of dollars, that 5% represents someone's salary, maybe multiple people's salary. And if you're having to finance the debt, well, you don't have a choice. You're going to have to let people go. And again, these are all short-sighted solutions to a problem that persists throughout whatever project it is, and it isn't just games. But what that all could just change next month when they're meeting. And in fact, like the the stock market is already starting to assume that that's what the Fed is going to do. No guarantee they will, and they might do it again at the end of the calendar year when they meet quarterly. But these are all factors. I mean, who in college is thinking about the Federal Reserve is going to determine whether I have a job yet? Absolutely matters.
So I want to thank John for giving us an answer, a pretty thorough answer on, the state of the industry and a bunch of different things that kind of play into his opinion on the state of the industry. Some of the interesting takeaways from my perspective is careerism in games really only starting in the mid-90s. I just think it's absolutely crazy that the games industry is as young as it is in terms of like actually having a full-time career. It's crazy to think it's barely over 30 years old. Absolutely bonkers from my perspective, Aaron.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. As I hurtle towards 30, it like you said recently in an off mic conversation, it's fascinating to think that the two of us are very nearly as old as the sort of solidified concept of having a long-term career. I hesitate to say sustainable career, but supposedly a sustainable career in the games industry. I mean, it does still speak to something that I have mentioned, if not on the show, then certainly a lot in my personal conversations, which is just how comparatively young the medium of video games is in comparison to other forms of art, media, and entertainment at large, right? Mm-hmm. So in many ways, comparing it to film, video games are still in their infancy. And there's still a lot of stuff to be figured out. That's not to say that films have figured it out necessarily as an industry, but that sort of thing is just so much more established than video games. So yeah, it's wild to have it put in perspective like that.
Well, also, I think before leading into the next section, it's just interesting if you think about it, because if we only have 30 years worth of data, it's not really enough data to have any real understanding of what the trends are in reality.
Right.
A lot of the stuff we're just making up as we go, especially because of the massive jumps that we've seen from a technological perspective in terms of what's possible with games, in terms of console, PC power, all of that. I feel like, and I could be ignorant when I say this, but even with something like film that's been around at least twice, if not three times as long, I'm like testing my entertainment history knowledge.
It's been a while.
Yeah. But my point being is it's been around a lot longer, but I feel like it hasn't seen the same technological growth over the course of its short lifespan like games has. And so obviously film's going through a lot of like weird kind of unsustainable growth like games are now, but it's been around a little bit longer. It's got some of the union protections, etc. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, to a topic. Yes. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so if we're talking about film in general, we're looking at well over 100 years of film history. But insofar as like the Hollywood studio system, that sort of thing is younger than film itself, obviously. But yeah, the other again thing that we, at least that I found interesting, in terms of talking about the cyclical nature of some of the boom and bust ish cycles. Again, no one saw COVID coming, and that is sort of unprecedented, and it kind of throws a wrench in trying to critically build a model for when we may see something on the scale of these layoffs happen again, right? Because it's again such a young set of metrics to throw such a wild outlier into and then try and come up with reliable predictions from. So I found that side of things, again, very, very interesting. Not to beat a dead horse and just keep saying that things are interesting. But one of the other components of the conversation that we were having surrounding the state of the games industry veered off towards the current push towards unionization, which is something that you, Zach, and I have, of course, talked about ad nauseum on the show and off. But John, a man of many opinions and one who can speak to them with great authority, did, of course, have some thoughts on unionization in the games industry, and I think they're worth checking out.
And guess what's happening now? Game studios are actually unionizing now, which I think is really great because that happened during the pandemic. Really, it all really started, and I think this is worth underlining many times because people don't know this happened. There are people that are talking about we need a union in the game industry to the point where I got sick of hearing it. It's like, yeah, I want chiseled abs too, but that me asking for it doesn't mean I'm going to get them. We need a union. Well, you're going to have to sacrifice it. Understand that no unions in the history of labor in America ever got started unless someone died horribly. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory where people got locked inside and then burned alive. That's how unions got started in America. We're not seeing bodies come up with game development. I mean, it's a bad situation and people necessarily want to have some tool in their box to preserve their jobs for things that they can't control, but that's why it took a while. And what happened at Raven Software, owned by Activision up in Madison, Wisconsin, is that QA, quality assurance testers, at a point when they weren't not considered full-time employees, they were working through some third-party staffing agency. For whatever reason, some of them were made to move or being told if they wanted to continue working for Activision, they needed to move to Madison in December. If you don't know where Madison is, this is Wisconsin. That's Northern America. And they're being told they needed to move there in the dead of winter. Mm-hmm. And then they got there and there was some miscommunication and they were told that their job is gone. Well, what do you think they're going to say? They're going to say, fuck you, we're going to start a union, asshole. You're not going to take away my job for that. That's not fair. And that was the beginning of, that was the first studio to ever get under Communications Workers of America, CWA. Mm-hmm. And guess what? All of Activision QA is now unionized. And now Microsoft owns them, and they're recognizing that union. And now Bethesda Game Studios, the Starfield and Fallout 76 people are in the process of unionizing.
And the WoW team, the entire WoW team, my understanding.
And 3 different studios. Like one of the studio in Boston, it was called Proletariat, which is, again, hilarious that it was called that. And then they got bought by Blizzard. Yeah, they're making their own game, but like it basically got thrown to the wayside, and for reasons I don't entirely understand. But they ultimately became game development for World of Warcraft in Boston, and they tried to unionize after they got acquired by Activision Blizzard, and the report was that their CEO blocked it. And it's like, okay, if your CEO can ruin your union, then you don't understand how unions get started. The CEO doesn't need to give you permission. But yeah, like you just said, now 3 different studios that are working on World of Warcraft are now all unionized. And so it's a whole new ball game. And I've told people that because they're one of the Activision QA shops that's consolidated, and they work on all the different games, which again, for Activision, it's mostly Call of Duty flavor of some kind. I've told union reps who work at the QA shop here is that your relationship with your parent company is defined by a fight you haven't had yet. And there's already some rumblings now. The report this week is that, Raven, Madison, Wisconsin QA accused Microsoft and Xbox of bargaining in bad faith. So we'll just have to see how that happens. But these are things that did not happen until just a few years ago. So as far as what to expect and, what the perspective is going to be, I don't think anyone knows what it's going to be like if a whole bunch of testers actually go on strike. What it was like when the movie industry had to deal with the actors or the writers striking. What it did was it just set up a bunch of projects that either had to get delayed a whole bunch or got canceled entirely. That could happen to games as well, but it may mean that people don't lose their jobs at a big glance. And I mean, testers oftentimes would just get written off like hundreds at a time for reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to do their jobs. And it's all short-sighted stuff.
Obviously, this season we've talked about unions at least more than once, having Adam on as a union or ex-union organizer to talk with us earlier this season. But I think the interesting portion from the audio that we just heard with John was his conversation around, people wanting to have unions in games, but them not really taking root and getting a footing until things started to happen that were maybe a little bit more on the negative side. Obviously, in games, we haven't had people. There actually have been people who have died as a result of mistreatment. So that has actually happened, but not to the same scale as like it's the Triangle shirt factory.
Yeah.
Which, of course, if you don't know what that is, it's a horrific incident where that's the one where a bunch of people burned alive in a building. I think we're jumping out of it, right? So we haven't had anything like that, thank God. But it was an interesting point that you basically kind of have to have some kind of violence against the workers for unions to really take root. Because as it turns out, at least in America, people just don't get this fervent like push for like labor organizing unless there's like a really strong stimulus driving it, which in this case is abuse from the their employers.
Yeah. I think it kind of speaks to, and I don't want to sound in any way like I'm victim blaming because that is the furthest thing from my intention, but I think it kind of just speaks to, if not human nature, then certainly the nature of the culture in America, that we tend to be a lot more reactive than proactive, where it's not hard to look at a situation and say, well, certainly the workers here would benefit from a union, right? Stronger bargaining stances and, better protections and everything would all come part and parcel with that. But generally speaking, people don't take action on that until the slights against them are much more egregious and more difficult to ignore than they have been in the past. And I think it's pretty easy to see that is what's going on in the industry right now, right? So it stands to reason that people would, start taking that action now. And of course, as we've discussed, once the floodgates open and people start to see that progress is being made, suddenly those goals seem much more attainable and much more reasonable. And so, it's good that no one is, burned up in, a
game studio.
I was going to say in a big office somewhere in Irvine yet, but it's not to say that, the circumstances that have led us to where we are in any way, acceptable or, any less tragic in a lot of ways. But it will 100% be fascinating to see where this trend towards unionization goes, especially since, as John discussed, we don't know what an industry-wide strike looks like, among QA testers, right? We may end up seeing some of that stuff. I found that section of the conversation to be endlessly fascinating just because it honestly had not popped into my head that is now 100% a possibility, that we could see pauses in production on the level of the actors and writers strikes that we've seen in film and television.
I think the other interesting thing that John kind of points to is the conversation around at least the one union advocate that he was talking to, and Activision, I believe it was Activision, and saying that, your relationship is dictated by a conversation, or not a conversation, but a dispute that you haven't had with your parent company yet. I think that's really interesting because I do think we've got a lot of really young unions and union organizers in games, but none of them at a large scale have really had to fight back yet against their employer. In some cases they have, but I don't think there's been like a massive dispute. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when like rubber hits the road, so to speak, and there's actually like some kind of a movement or lawsuit against these parent companies of these unions. Which I believe there was one that was referenced in this conversation about Microsoft potentially bargaining in bad faith. So we'll see how all of that goes. But my point being here, I really hope that these unions are prepared to have an actual fight against these corporate entities, because if they expect the work to be done because they have a union, that is not when the work ends. The work well, it technically never ends, actually. It's just a continuous fucking slog against a corporation to make sure that they're not taking advantage of you. It starts with the union. It does not end with the union.
Yeah, that is true. And it'll also definitely be interesting to see, because the faces in game development just aren't as ubiquitous as the faces in Hollywood are, right? So when you see I'm going to date myself as like an old person, I guess. But like, if you think of like an established movie star, like a Tom Hanks or something like that, speaking out on the issues that have driven actors to striking, that carries some weight in the conversation, right? And so when they sit down at the negotiations with, representatives who are very, very influential within the industry, but also very, very recognizable to the lay person, there's definitely probably is a phenomenal way to discredit yourself as an authority when speaking. There's probably a different tenor to those conversations, right? So it'll be, again, really interesting to see what these untested waters look like for an industry where there aren't quite so many recognizable faces and bankable names, and people for whom studios have rolled out the red carpet because they basically funded their entire portfolio.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, looking at our time here, I do want to lead into the final section, which is, as always, we gave John an opportunity to plug some of the causes, organizations, projects that he cares about. So we'll go to that audio right now. Make sure to check them out. We appreciate John for jumping on the show. And without further ado.
Well, certainly, Game Dev Beer Night we do once a month at Brutorium in Austin. Been doing that for a number of years now and been enjoying myself quite a bit. It's what I'm known for. But I'll also be doing a whole bunch of things. I probably won't be spending a whole lot of time advertising, but I'm probably going to be doing another portfolio posse in October. And I may also be involved with facilitating mock interviews for engineers. And these are things that I'm absolutely not going to advertise a whole lot of people, because the two things I worry about most are I throw a party and no one comes, and then I throw a party and there are too many people there and it's a crummy experience and people blame me. So I kind of have to balance between the two things. But generally speaking, people look me up. I'll talk to anyone.
Well, before we get into our typical outro, I just want to give one more round of thanks to John for jumping on the show today. John, we 100% appreciate you jumping on, talking with us about some of the topics. Again, sorry we had some technical issues, so a decent portion of the audio is actually not in this episode, but it was a very pleasant conversation. I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone listening also learned a lot. John is truly like a font of information and truly someone that cares about, the youth coming into the games industry and really trying to help them succeed, or at least get an understanding of what the landscape actually looks like so they're better prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. As a non-Austin native, this was my first chance to actually meet John, albeit through audio rather than video or in person. But I thoroughly enjoyed the conversations that we had both on and off mic. And to John, thank you again very, very much for, being on the show, taking the time and sharing some of your insights with us. You seem like a stand-up chap, and everything that I have heard outside of our conversations, it really does sound like both in the Austin area and outside of it, John really is almost an invaluable resource for a lot of people who are trying to navigate this extremely knotted up, confusing industry. So thank you for taking some time away from that endeavor in order to, be on our humble little show. So yet again, thank you. And actually, on the note of thank yous, Zach, you like music?
I love music, Aaron.
Have you heard Beach Girl?
I don't know if I have, Aaron. Who's Beach Girl?
Beach Girl is an exceptionally talented musician. They actually, you might not know this. I know sometimes the fugue states come, but they actually provided our exceptional intro and outro music.
That's what those wonderful beats are that I hear at the beginning and end of. Oh my God, I had no idea.
Yes, the wonderful beats, the tunes, the beeps, and the boops, all of them. The coin drop, Zach, is Beach Girl.
Oh my God.
But Beach Girl is so much more. Beach Girl is also a collection of wonderful tunes that you can find just about anywhere that digital music can be procured. I'm talking SoundCloud, I'm talking Bandcamp, I'm talking YouTube, I'm talking Spotify, I'm talking the one that Apple does that's not iTunes anymore. Wherever you can find songs on the interwebs, you can find Beach Girl, and I recommend that you do, Zach, because it's good.
That's crazy.
So thank you, Beach Girl.
That's crazy. Well, you know what else is good, Aaron?
Chicken wings.
That's true. And if you like the KF console, you should check out anyway. Callback to like 3 years ago. If you're looking for some good visual stimulus, I would highly recommend that you check out eDougieArt. Now, eDougieArt is this wonderful person and friend that has helped us procure our art that we use for our videos, it's our logo. I don't know why I always struggle to remember logo when I'm doing the outro, but regardless, she helped us with our logo and a lot of our color scheme and our font and everything. She's absolutely fantastic. And she has an Etsy page and an Instagram that you should definitely check out. And I don't want to say that the whole Lord of the Rings thing wouldn't have happened if if Gandalf would have bought an eDougieArt art piece, but I'm not also saying that it would not have happened. I lost the double negatives.
You're not saying it isn't true.
Yeah, I'm just saying Sauron's gonna die one day, and it's because I'm gonna smack him with some fucking glorious art. I don't know if that joke's actually funny. Anyway, eDougieArt's great. So is Beach Girl. Make sure to check both of them out, and we will see all of you lovely people later. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks again, John, and goodbye.
Goodbye!
Yeah, well, I'm very much in favor of space tourism. There are such things as obscenely rich people, and I very much like the idea of shooting them into space with rockets.